The half-life of ghosts. Data need not die, but it decays. Digits disappear and are displaced. Bit rot from radiation exposure, magnetic fields weakening, or simply old age. Never dying, perpetually deteriorating. Once there were machines and devices deployed in droves to restore climate, taps that reflected sunlight, drones that sowed seeds, planes that made clouds and rain, solar-powered crafts that scanned and monitored, balloons that carried out experiments and collected data. Over time, their bodies perished. Even then, the fading memories of these beings lingered on. First, we misread, then we reimagined. In a time when the heat was unbearable and the storms came often, they began to grow scales on their skins, strange feelers and tentacles, webs and sails, tails and tangles. Their stories transformed and resurrected from the corrupted ones and zeros, revealed creatures of another time. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. Welcome to the No Evil exhibition talk, Echoes from the Forest. I'm Jennifer Chen. Tonight we're here at SCI-Arc Gallery in the Arts District in downtown Los Angeles. Inside the No Evil exhibition itself, amongst the trees, the shrines, the artifacts from an imagined post-climate world, and the ghostly presence of creatures from the future past. We're also surrounded by audience all around, in front of us, behind us, and of course our guests, Spiros Michalakis, mathematical physicist at Caltech and outreach manager at the Institute for Quantum Information and Matter, and science advisor on films such as Ant-Man, Spider-Man, Homecoming, Captain Marvel, and many others. And from what I hear, a good many films have been born and killed by Spiros. We have Lois Rosson, a historian of science and technology. She's the 2023 to 24 Octavia E. Butler Fellow at the Huntington Library, working on a book about the visual legibility of outer space. She has held fellowships at the Smithsonian's National and Air and Space Museum and the Berggruen Institute. Ghostly presence is also what we will become tonight. As we are all being scanned live, our existence forever preserved as clouds of data points by Mackenzie Champlin, and a master's student here at SCI-Arc, also thanks to our partnership with Leica. This is a bit of an experiment so that we can continue from where the story of No Evil started, to preserve memories and data. And who knows, future people might discover this and think that we're all mythical beings. So you're free to move around. You don't have to stay still for that. As the oxymoron goes, act natural. So tonight I'm going to talk a bit about the work, ideas that have consumed my mind while making this exhibition. Hopefully they will serve as prompts for our conversation afterwards as we exchange thoughts, sat here in the forest around an imaginary fire. The sailing mirage, wings flapping. They appear to be sailing in the wind. If you stared at them long enough, they flew without moving, anchored to the ground, a mirage born out of the hot desert dunes. They were many. A flock stretched as far as the eye could see, one next to another in perfect murmuration. When they appeared, they cast shadows so vast and for so long that they altered seasons. No Evil started as a reflection of our attitude towards geoengineering as a climate restoration approach, and by extension, our attitude towards science and technologies and climate change. Geoengineering technologies and systems are radical, uncertain, expensive, even controversial. Some cannot condone us meddling with nature to fix our planet when our meddling with nature is what broke it. Others cry foul over what seems to be the injustice of allowing business as usual for the culprits and their shirking of deep-rooted responsibilities. As we are heading for the point of no return, it may no longer be enough just to pull the plug on fossil fuels or achieve net zero carbon emission, even if we could do it, calculation of which is itself a deep mire of misnomer and misdirections with unreliable and unaccountable schemes of carbon credits, opaque measuring policies, and full of what the climate change social scientist Holly Jean Buck calls accounting errors. We just may not even have as long as we think we do before it's too late. On top of climate mitigation, that is to stop further carbon emission in order to curb the rising temperature, perhaps it's time we should think about climate restoration, to actively remove the carbon dioxide in our atmosphere and to decrease the temperature. And to do that, you might just have to go big and intervene at the planetary scale. Scientists are trying to come up with solutions in geoengineering. They don't know if they will work, and they don't know enough about the ramifications. They need more research, experiments, data, and support. The show is a response to this skepticism in technology when it comes to saving the world, as if an act so important should only come from us, as if technology is this other entity, and that if we relied on it, somehow we would be selling our souls. With no evil, I wanted to look at the bright side, take us right out the other end, and just to imagine that it did work, and we were all saved, and to imagine that in venerating these mythical creatures, we will be in fact celebrating and memorializing our own global endeavor when all of us came together, united in a single vision. The mothering dragonfly, eternally pregnant, they gave birth to the forest of the world. Where they laid their eggs, trees grew for hundreds of years. Barren lands turned into fertile grounds. Some say they still live. Their undying maternal instincts persist. They return to guard their nests, hermits in the forest they gave birth to. As the climate collapses around us, we're given all the data and evidence science can offer. Yet until we experience the impact of climate change firsthand, we are observing the catastrophe unfolding at arm's length. This is when fictions and stories could be a powerful tool to let us imagine what the charts and graphs cannot show. Stories can transcend facts and figures and slip deep into our minds and cultures. They can connect something as large as planetary events with our own lives. They're portals through which we can experience the consequences of our present-day actions in speculated worlds, future or otherwise. They help us to refocus our worldviews and perspectives. In the same way that seeing the photograph of the whole Earth for the first time had instilled a new understanding between us and our planet and helped boost the environmental movement in the 70s, a certain detachment in space might help us see the whole picture. In No Evil, a detachment in time might enable us to look past the details to what is the essence of the story. I was interested in taking a positive view of the future as a response to our desensitized view of the impact of climate change and a reaction against the common cli-fi trope of dystopic visions. We are so used to what by right should shock us and petrify us into action, but somehow we have developed a blind spot right in front of our eyes. At the same time, No Evil is not a utopian story either. It is not an unrealistically perfect future. As the tropo-strato tapestry speaks of the defiant nature in us, no evil simply suggests that we can survive this. The all-seeing eagle, so long as the sun shines, they will continue to fly. They are solo wanderers. They do not hunt, they only observe with their all-seeing eyes. After a long journey, they come back to tell us what they see in their travels, giving us views of the world from a perspective we could never reach. They are soothsayers. We heed their warnings, and in return, they give us hope. I'm fascinated by the unexpected outcomes or consequences of technologies, glitches, we call them. The idea that data, something that is meant to exist forever, actually decays and is fragile. That mortality suddenly gives it a mythical quality because it too transforms over time. Yet it is something so universal. Every culture has a creation story or mythical creatures. No evil dives into how mythologies might come from. The way that a blurry, out of focus picture of a cloud formation might be mistaken as UFO, or a grainy photograph of a log floating in the water might lead us to seeing monsters lurking underneath. Or through natural phenomena like the Fata Morgana, a mirage above the ocean surface seen over the horizon might spawn the legends of the floating citadel, or the Flying Dutchman that got passed down through generations and lasted centuries. A corrupted digital file containing data relating to the drones or the aircrafts, given enough time has passed, might just become new creation stories. The gloomy spider. Wherever they flew, they brought rain. From under their wings outspun silky strands in the sky, strands that make clouds, clouds that grow heavy. You may not like the gloomy spiders, but where they have been, the air is crisp and the ground is cool. The flowers grow and the animals drink. At the end of their lives, they return home to the storm that they have spawned. That the digital data could possess affectations of analog conditions is something also captured my imagination. When the passage of time has made the glitches obsolete, we project new meanings onto them. That marriage between the digital and the analog in these images might have given rise to a new form of craft, ones that have taken on formal language of the glitch, corruption, imperfection, unevenness, asymmetry, rough texture, tarnished or blended paint, that even cracks in the old buildings and ruins may be gilded in gold. The curious jellyfish. Once they go up, they do not come back, forever asking questions. They learn and they prophesize. Sometimes they send messages back to us, guiding us from the cosmos. Other times, they take the secrets with them as they leave this world. What they have discovered then, we will never know. This future epoch in no evil suggests a world that might not have borders or separation and differentiation of cultures. The shrines and stories draw reference from cultures and belief systems across the world, where perhaps it shouldn't be surprising that they all have similar purposes and features. You might find the artifacts are now even somewhat recognizable and familiar, but you cannot pinpoint their origin. No evil doesn't imagine that there will be multiple cultures coexisting, but that they will influence and merge into one another, a pan-cultural future. It imagines that the only way this could have happened is when climate justice is established and upheld, when the whole world came together. the forest of last defense. A long time has passed since their last sightings. Some believe they are still out there, living in the forest, up in the clouds, buried in the sands, continuing to guard the world since its rebirth from the ashes. People built shrines for them, adorned with ornaments and offerings in vivacious hues and vibrant colors. Others come on pilgrimages to where old flood walls, bunkers, and turbines once stood, the sites of our last defense. Here, they worship and pray for these elusive creatures to appear once more. They are the reason of our existence, the roots of our culture and heritage. Our children grow up to their stories. In the crumbled ruins of the last defense, what was once the technologies at the forefront of engineering are now sites of worship and memorial. The glitches from the corrupted data have become the fiber of new cultural curiosities. Between the digital decay and the analog corruption, the rusting patina and the fading memories, a new form of craft has risen from these future mythologies. Thank you. Thank you. So, what did you think?
How do I turn the... it's already on.
Wow.
Amazing. Well, first, I just want to congratulate you on a really strong body of work. This is an incredible exhibition. There's tons to discuss. The first thing that really comes to my mind, Jennifer, and I mentioned this to you a little bit earlier today, is how in the history of science, and I'm trained as a historian of science, right, which is sort of a niche subfield in history as a discipline, but in the history of science, we tend to narrate the scientific revolution as a process of disenchantment, right? So it represents a turn in time where we started to narrate the forces of nature as being mechanistic in origin as opposed to spiritual, however you want to define that. And if you want to take the really, really, really long view, I think that there's a way to say that that outlook really culminates in the high modernism of the mid 20th century, right? Which are forms that, you know, many of the mythological creatures that you've outlined for us take, right? Like the shapes of these things are very much informed by the weapons logic of the military industrial complex in mid-century, right? But what you're doing, and what I think is so profound, is that this is like a re-enchantment of this material, right? We're sort of ascribing the spiritual back into these forms, whereas the sort of rubric of scientific rationalism had sort of pushed all of that out, right? And so in imagining this post-dystopia, right? Climate change, man-made climate change has, in this vision, right, sort of tuckered itself out, and we can kind of rebuild in a way that's free from all of that political detritus. We can construct new mythologies around it. And so this re-enchantment, I think, is a really fascinating dimension of this work, which also reminds me a lot of what Spiros does in talking about science in the movies. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts on that as well.
I will never be as eloquent as Lois over here. Wow. And also, Jen, I mean, well done. For me, the moment, it was a bit unexpected because I've had a chance to come and walk around a few weeks ago when it was opening. And I didn't realize that you were trying to re-enchant, you know, I mean, it feels like that. I told you it was like a Hayao Miyazaki experience just walking around here. But when you said something about how technology at some point became a dirty word when it came to helping the world, right? And there's many reasons that technology is considered as a powerful tool that is often used for evil, not for good, by ourselves, because we don't know, we're not smart enough often, right? Emotionally intelligent, not, you know, on the IQ side, to figure out how to use technology. But I realized something. I was thinking about it, and I was like, what is it about technology that is actually awesome? And the truth is that, as a Greek quantum physicist, I always go back to the etymology of words because so many of them are from Greece. And I was like, wait a minute, technology actually means the logic of art. Does anyone know here what the word is for art in Greek? It's techni, like techno also, but it's techni. Technologia, right, is the original word for technology in Greek. And this is the reasoning, the logos behind art. It has nothing to do with engineering. In fact, the ancient Greeks had no such idea of technology. They were very specifically naturalists in thinking that we should not mess around with nature, but we should create with nature, right? Work with nature. So they were very geoengineered minds in that sense. But again, kind of the same way that Hayao Miyazaki and other creatives like that, and yourself now, is thinking about it, where you become part of nature and then you reimagine it in a way that is not just from a human point of view, but it's from nature's point of view as well. And as scientists, at Caltech, we have these flying drones that are supposed to be able to go to any planet, right? Mars, anywhere we go, and autonomously explore the planet. But the way to create something like that, where it can last for a while, right, on its own energy source, and some from the sun, you need to learn about from nature. The simplest things, like your floating ghosts over there, how you can just allow nature to do its thing and then mess with it as little as possible to get something back that is useful for us as the human race. And there is always a tension, right, between what we want of it, what it wants to give us naturally.
That's beautiful. Well, that's beautiful. I mean, thank you both for those amazing comments straight away. I feel like I've achieved something, just hearing those. That reminded me of what we talked a little bit about earlier, that, for example, one of the creatures, the all-seeing eye, which was basically modeled on, a glider, solar power glider that is crucial as part of the monitoring, fleet, because geoengineering, a lot of it is about just constant monitoring and making sure that things are going in the right way. And because we're talking about an area so vast, it's not someone going up there, it's constantly kind of remote sensing systems, going through it. So the idea that craft is powered by the sun, and we were just talking about how actually everything is powered by the sun, and when you think about it. And so, the way you were talking about this, thinking from their point of view, and maybe that's why these creatures came so readily available in my head, is that when you look at what they do, what they're trying to do with or without our, interventions in them, they are doing what we're also trying to do. Obviously with our inventions of technologies and all that, but just what you pointed out there about kind of our relationship with these autonomous machines just really kind of ring true, to my mind. And I love the idea that I am re-enchanting, science. I'm going to add that to my bio. I'm a science re-enchanter. I love
fully
that.
Endorse this.
And I think, without me kind of thinking about it, perhaps the way, the fact that I have made no evils setting so far into the future, right? We're so far into the future that data has decayed and no one remembered what happens, that, planet surviving events have become new creation stories, right? Like that, because we're so far ahead into the future, so much time has passed that there is this opportunity, to re-enchant it, and not deliberately. That's not the intention. That's the effect, right? That's a consequence of it. So I really love that, the way you guys picked up on those. That's fascinating.
Yeah, I feel like one place too where that really stood out to me was actually in the sequence of photos that you showed of the child getting progressively more glitchy. Because, when I think about like a digital file, I really think about that in the abstract, right? Or like I think about a photograph. But when you think about an image starting to decay, right, it's really, that kind of is the way that it gets reclaimed by the ecosystem, right, that it's a part of, right? It starts to demonstrate age and materiality in this way that's really foreign to us. So the fact that the glitch, right, which also is this extremely glittering and beautiful pictorial phenomenon, is something that you picked up on to echo through these forms, I think is also very remarkable.
I'm going to drop some quantum physics on all y'all.
We've been waiting for that.
Thank you. That was like, thanks. That's great. So there is no such thing as glitches in the universe. And even when you're doing quantum experiments, which is like at the cutting edge of any human endeavor where you're testing reality itself, right? The universe doesn't make mistakes. Okay, it's our interpretation, right? There's no noise in your experiments. There's nothing like that. There's no corruption in the data. In fact, one of the things that most people don't know, including most physicists and computer scientists, is that the pixel, the thing that would get corrupted, is not a pixel. Like, it's not a digital thing. There is nothing in the universe that is digital. If you look at the mathematical formulation of a pixel and what it's represented then on a screen and whatnot, it's not something that is uniquely defined at a particular point in space and time. It is spread out. It looks to us like it is something that only exists at a particular point. And you could say, well, okay, if you zoom in, yes, there's some things around it. No, I mean at the mathematical level, which also describes the quantum realm. Right? What is actually happening when you lose the pixel, or it turns from a 0 to a 1 or something like that? All that happens is that it becomes entangled, literally quantum entangled, correlated with another part of the environment, the universe outside of it, where it used to be unknown to it. They had no relationship, and now they formed a relationship. So that information that we lose is there. It's just we're not looking at it from the right point of view. And even black holes, this is exactly what's happening with all black holes. Are like, black because light cannot escape because of the gravitational pull. It's so strong. But the information is all there. It's just scrambled up from a human or micro point of view. And what I love about what you're doing is that by adding the dimension of time to technology and the human conception of creativity and how do you accept that future, there's a big difference between like 20 years down the line and 20,000 years down the line. Right? But from the point of view of a block universe, in fact, the multiverse, the block multiverse, there is no such thing as time or now or something that is important, right, versus later or the past. It's all one thing, and it is different slices of the way we get to view small, perspectives that move through, right, space-time, that get to experience it the way that we do. There exists always point of view where everything's perfect. Everything, nothing ever decayed, like none of that. But this is also the most uninteresting and boring, place to exist. Right?
Yeah, and so that also reminds me of a conversation that we had a couple months ago about the predictive power of science fiction and how people often get caught up in science fiction's ability to predict the future as some sort of metric of its quality, right? But that's really not the point of science fiction. And I think that what you've done so beautifully, and this is something I think that you were just getting at, Spiros, too, is that what you've done is you've given us a point in the future that's so distant in the future that it denaturalizes all of the things that we take for granted about contemporary modernism, politics, and all. And so you're able to sort of enter in this re-enchantment, right? But then also give us a set of fresh eyes on which to glimpse these forms, right? That, like, again, the cracks in the concrete foundation, right, might be gilded and celebrated as a sign of beauty from their trauma, or, that these reinterpretations will, sort of stem from the material, but sort of be washed away from, the eons of mythology that we sort of cultivated up until this point. And I think that that's really remarkable too, because as you were getting at also in your presentation, right? Climate futures are deeply political, right? And it's extremely difficult to talk about any type of solution, right? Without, hitting some sort of political wall. One of my favorite anecdotes about environmentalism in the 1970s is that conservatives in the United States primarily reacted to environmentalists as a form of new millenarian, which is just a fancy way of somebody who thinks that the end of times is nigh, right? And that, it's going to be heralded, by the coming of a prophet, which in this case was, the degradation of the environment and, that man had sort of committed these sins against the planet. But they were sort of arguing, right, that the rhetoric of the environmentalist movement, right, was sort of taking on some of the same ideologies of like the religious movements that they themselves were also critiquing. And so the politics of this is just always so inescapable, right? Because, since the 1970s, there have been tons of studies that have shown the ways in which the American brand of environmentalism, right, is deeply exclusionary and often racist, right? And, is predicated on an understanding of who gets access to the environment. And so by fast forwarding us to, and I like thinking about it also as a post-dystopia because it's so hard to imagine these things not happening, that by conceptualizing of it in terms of after it's all tuckered itself out, right? Like it still gives room for like all of these inevitabilities to shake out. And then imagine something beyond that from which we can rebuild, which I think is a really, really valuable piece of perspective and is science fiction, climate fiction in this case, at its finest.
Yeah, I was thinking, if I were to ask someone to help me like save the world, and I'm a scientist, okay, and imagine that I know what to do with geoengineering, right? And we put some nanoparticles, gold nanoparticles up in the atmosphere, right? And then they absorb the high energy rays, cools the planet, we're in good shape, all that stuff. I don't think I would be able to actually do anything useful without a creative mind, a designer, actually. I was thinking, without even, it's not because you're all here, right? I really am thinking that for myself to be inspired and to inspire others to come up with really fun, creative solutions versus brute forcing it, right? That everyone feels is like, you don't want to, that looks terrible, that looks dystopian. How do you turn something that is dystopian into something that you're like, wow, that is like, I want to be part of this, right? This is new. And so I was thinking that one of the most creative designers of all time is nature, right? The original technologist of all time is nature. It has found a way through evolution and other tricks to design some of the most amazing machines out there to keep itself going. Until we kind of showed up and we thought like, we were a bit smarter than it and we wanted to do some localized, changes. And I really do believe that to go back to become more like nature is not just to go out there and start hugging trees. It is more about having this very deep intelligence that comes with appreciating design. Right? And my friend Ibru is right here. And I thought I was smart enough to be able to figure out how to design space, right? Home. It's like very important for each of us to have something that can relax. And then she shows up, she's like, looks around, she's like, all right, your carpet is wrong. It's oriented wrong. But just turn it 90 degrees. I'm like, that's just silly. He's like, let's just do it. Turn it around. I was like, oh my God, I want to be here all the time now. It was the craziest thing. I was like, how can this be? Come on, mathematically speaking, like this makes no sense. And these things can make such a difference. And also working with Marvel, like it was the same thing where I go in there and originally I felt like we need to get the quantum physics right. There's so many cool things about quantum physics, right? The quantum realm. I want to make sure when I work with them, with Paul Rudd and Peyton Reed and the others, that they get it, right? But the conversation made me feel like, wait a minute, I don't get it. I don't get what is actually so awesome about it, right? Because I'm not childlike anymore in my passion and appreciation for it. I have all this mathematical, exactly. It was a bit disenchanted, say like almost shut up and calculate, which is many of my colleagues like feel that way. Just don't worry about what it means or why it is, right? Just use it to build a quantum computer.
Oh no, I was just telling Spiros that it's because he's become disenchanted, so he needs to be re-enchanted. But one of the things I think that Spiros is touching on that I think is also especially resonant here is the fact that we tend to overlook storytelling as a type of technology, right? And it very much is. Like when you think about mythology, right, in the oral tradition, right, the sort of mnemonic format of, memorizing and telling somebody something as a story is a really great preservation method. And so I feel like that is something that often gets lost. This is actually one of the things that I love about Octavia Butler in the Parable series. She sort of, the arc of the series sort of bends towards the construction of this religion that the protagonist doesn't even really believe in, right? It's a secular faith, but it is a faith no less. But then at the end of spoiler alert, at the end of the two novels, right, it's revealed that was the only possible strategy to ensure humanity's expansion into space, right? Because these big projects take multiple generations, that sort of the only way to organize people emotionally and intellectually was actually using religion as a vehicle. And so you get this sort of, it's a religion, but it's faith-based, but then isn't everything faith-based anyway? Sort of we're all buying into this system. But I really, again, this sort of pagan re-enchantment and sort of the mythologizing of these forms that we have scientific explanations for now, right, feels like this sort of turn back to sort of the original purpose of storytelling, right, which is a way to preserve information, right, and to make sure that it's able to propagate.
I was going to say, this is really interesting what you just said, Lois, because from the point of view also of getting disenchanted. About this happened to me about 8 years ago. While I was a postdoc at Caltech before I transitioned into a research scientist and doing outreach also, and I was kind of bored at that point. And what happened that reignited everything, and it happened even before I was connected to Marvel and all that stuff, was, I think it was a friend of mine, a colleague, who asked, is time fundamental, right? Because when you think of in physics, most of the time, whether you're looking from the relativistic point of view, what is known as Einstein's theory of space-time, and that the two are kind of connected, or from quantum theory, what is known as the Schrödinger equation, which is the master equation of everything in the universe, how everything evolves as a quantum system, and hence as classical. Time is just there. You don't know why is time, or where it came from. It's just a parameter, and it just runs. And I remember thinking that I was bothered by it. I was like, damn it, where does it come from? And then it opened up Pandora's box with where does all this other stuff come from that I've learned, right? And this is where I became re-enchanted with everything around me, because I realized I had all the mathematical background I've had developed over 3 decades finally came to bear, and I started trying to answer questions that I had as a kid. Not as just, a quantum physicist at Caltech, there's serious work, you need to do this and that. And it just, I was listening to a podcast, must have been about a year ago, and a friend and colleague, Kip Thorne, he won the Nobel Prize for gravitational wave detection, all that stuff. He's an amazing guy. But he was on the podcast and he said, you know what? I didn't actually want to do the LIGO stuff. This is the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Observatory, the thing that got him the Nobel Prize. He's like, I didn't really want to do this. towards the middle to, late 90s, I wanted to understand how time travel worked. And he wrote some of the most interesting papers about how you could take wormholes, shortcuts in space, right? And by moving the two mouths of the wormhole relative to each other, using Einstein's relativity, you could create a time machine, what is known as closed time-like curves. And I was thinking to myself, that's actually, we don't do research on this stuff, not because it is beneath us, but because we almost think it is impossible. It is so high above where you're asking the why of the universe, right, of everything, that you think it's impossible. So for me, there is a way now to be able to bring the two worlds together, right? The world of the rigorous that allows you to take an idea. How insane is it that everything around us was just nothing but neural impulses at some point, and then we made walls, we made TVs, we made electronics behind that, we understood electromagnetic waves, even though these things are impossible and invisible, like Wi-Fi signals everywhere, so we turned the invisible into visible, but it came from just some random thought, and it was converted. And for me, when I started doing quantum physics from that point of view of like trying to answer the why of things, not the how or the what, which is like what mathematics and physics focuses on in science, things became way more interesting. And I think we can use that idea to get technology exciting again.
Well, I mean, exactly that. I think what you pointed out, both of you, is this idea, it's really about our attitude, isn't it? Like the information's there, the situation's there, we can slice it however we want to, but really it's just to get our mind in the right mindset to be able to decipher the noise, from the productive thoughts and constructive thoughts and actually act on it. I love physics. I keep telling him that. Like every time when I see him, I blush and I go, oh my God, I wanted to be a physicist when I was younger. And why did I choose architecture? All of that. But because I kind of grew up watching documentaries and thinking physicists telling us how beautiful the world is, like you don't need to find more reasons. You don't need to, I'm an atheist, so you don't need to find religion. You don't need to find all those things. It's all here. It's all around us. And it also got me thinking about what you were saying, that, maybe it's a double-edged sword that, we also are looking for faith or whatever it is, however you want to call it. But because of that, it is inherently political, right? People devise, systems in order to manipulate and control and govern and all of that. And that as I'm doing No Evil, I constantly thinking about geoengineering and past work and studios that I've run on the same subject, is that you can't get away from politics. The same way that all of these things, it's all interrelated. You cannot isolate, these kind of discussions, and which is why it's our attitude that still is the only variable, right, that you can actually control and you can actually change. And I guess when you talk about, designers, and, I think despite the fact that I always wanted to be, and I still do want to be a physicist, but I do love the ability to be able to design, and not just because I can make beautiful things or, or just look at objects but more that because I can affect change through things that I happen to be able to have the skills to manipulate and work with and be able to, sort of find craft within. But it's that ability to affect change. And I think with No Evil, at the heart of it really is just to say that whether it's through storytelling or whether it's through imagining, which is what designers are good at, being able to speculate, but then at the same time, you're able to speculate the change that you might be able to affect. And I think all of these things are really pointing to I don't know, motivation or trying to get people to think about it in a different way. How is it possible that we could be skeptical about technologies and science, right? I mean, I can never get my head around it other than, I don't know, misinformation or politics, or money or other things that come in. But surely, if we have the right kind of motivation and mindset and enough of us have that, surely we can all affect change in that way,
I have thoughts.
I
have thoughts. Unfortunately, I have thoughts. Wow, there's so much to unpack there. But for me, the most exciting aspect of quantum physics, and weirdly things keep coming back to quantum, but I promise it's not because I'm a quantum physicist. This goes somewhere. The most interesting thing that happened once I allowed myself to start answering the why questions, or try to answer them, was that I had to go to the foundations of quantum physics. And I don't mean the physics foundation. I went to the mathematical foundations. And then when you go to the mathematical foundations, but then you start asking like why questions at the level of mathematics, it gets kind of crazy. Very few people even think of ever doing that, right? They're like, okay, there's a proof, there's a theorem, just shut up and use it, learn it. They'll become building blocks for the conceptual framework that is all of quantum physics. But if we ask like, why is this true? Why did I choose these axioms? These are the fundamental truths, the foundations upon which, the mathematical ones, right? I will build the whole edifice of physics. Why this one? Why that one? That is, it breaks your mind at that point a little bit, and then it reforms it at the meta level, right? So when we're talking about faith, and Jen, when you're saying like, if only people could think about it in the right way, from the right mindset. Personally, I've come to believe that there is no right point of view. There's useful point of view, right? But there is no fundamental point of view. In fact, again, when I went to the foundations of the mathematical foundations of quantum physics, the place where all of mathematics itself comes from, I was like, wow, there's like very little here. There's like the only thing that exists, the only truth it faces you is that there is no other truth, that everything goes, right? That the foundation of reality itself, it is fully pluripotent. There is nothing fundamental, no space, no time, laws of physics, everything is emergent. And then the question becomes, where the heck does order come from? If at the foundation there is pure chaos, where do you get order? And when you get literally into quantum physics, the most fundamental aspect of that theory is a point of view. The thing that filters out, that instantiates a particular reality, is not that this is the only thing that exists for you to look at, is because this is the only way that you're looking at it right now. And just like I can look at all of you, but I cannot look at my face, right? We don't freak out when we think about, okay, our point of view in space is 180 degrees from each other. But imagine this is like a question about time, that I am moving in the opposite direction than you are, in time, not in space. I'm going towards your past and you're going towards my future. That would kind of break your mind. And there's an infinite number of dimensions along which we could break from each other as we're moving through them. We just cannot imagine what that looks like. So the point of view for me is a primitive, is the foundation. And realizing that, then it means that in order to connect with each other, we shouldn't try to convince the other person that our point of view is the right one. The hardest part and the most fun part is the empathy part, is the journey from one point of view to the other person's point of view. That's where all the information lies. That's literally quantum entanglement tells you the information is not in you or in them, it is in your relationship between the two of you. And that's the hard work that you have to do often, right? To convince people to do something that they may not want to do. It's not to rationally tell them like, hey, this is what's happening, is to bring them along a story, right? Along a path with you from your own point of view, to start connecting and say, oh, I see, okay. That's my version of it. That's my version of geoengineering, of my version of like climate justice, right? But you're on that journey together versus against each other.
Yeah, I think that the thread that you guys are throwing on and have been for the last couple comments is a really fascinating one. And I feel like what I take from your comment, Spiros, is that we tend to think of scientific rationalism, right, and the sort of spiritual enchantment as sort of opposite poles on a spectrum when they don't actually have to be mutually exclusive, right? Like, you know, we actually have mechanisms, right, that describe very materially things that we don't understand at a large scale all the time, right? And so one of the things that I take away, I think, from this exhibition is actually the way that you have sort of blended together structures that we wouldn't necessarily think of as alive and put them in an ecosystem alongside our sort of imagined human descendants. And I bring that up because one of the things that just like tripped me out the most when I was first learning about astrobiology is one of the definitions that astrobiologists use in the search for life in the universe. And the definition is actually, it's something incredibly capacious. It's something like information that manages to like propagate materially over time, right? Which is an extremely, like you can think of so many things that do that you wouldn't necessarily think of as living, right? And I think that, you know, because then, you know, for me, where I always go, and this is, you know, just because I've been steeped in a lot of science fiction for the last like 8-9 months, right? Is, you know, all of the stories that we get in sci-fi that sort of imagine the planet as just a large singular organism, right? That is alive and feeling, right? But that sort of metabolizes at a time scale that is imperceptible to us, right? Because it is so long. And so so to get back to how I think this connects to your exhibition, Jen, is that, you know, again, what we get are, you know, the remnants of drones that have forgotten their initial purpose and have been reintegrated into an ecosystem in this really critical way. And even though we wouldn't necessarily determine that as a structure that is alive, right, it still is this key component. And I feel like thinking about ecosystems and complex wholes, right, is actually one of the most valuable political outcomes of imagining a climate future, right? I think that we've actually been focusing on individual organisms and individual facets of networks as opposed to the sort of bioregenerative nature of the way that things can work together. And so, yeah, I think that, you know, your question of, you know, why have we demonized technology, right, as this force that can be used explicitly only for evil, right? And sort of how can we neutralize it in this vision of this climate future, right? Because, I mean, you know, functionally, you know, like if you think about human society, right, technology is almost just a function of that, right? Like, is a house a technology, right? Like, you could probably make an argument that your arm is a form of technology, right, in some senses. So the technological component, I feel, is inevitable, right? And so this, again, imagining this future where all of those things are integrated, living or not, I think is a really valuable jumping off point.
I love that because, you know, when I never thought that in the world of no evil that we are imagining that these creatures are alive. You know, that there's a bit of like, it goes quite meta. Yeah, I mean, your territory, Spiros. But just the idea that I'm projecting into the future, thinking people are believing that these things used to exist. So neither is fact, whether you're thinking about it from a future point of view, looking back, or from a current point of view, looking, you know, forward. You know, but maybe that's why I'm kind of constantly staying in this limbo, because I can get away with it. You know, I don't have to answer a lot of the difficult, you know, questions. But maybe that's the other point, not to undersell my own work here, is that maybe those aren't important questions to solve. You know, I mean, I can,
yeah.
But then we'll all be kind of busy debating, did I get that right? Or, you know, are there other versions to kind of explain this connection between them. And I guess maybe, that's why I sort of just went, no, it's not about predicting. It's not about asking people to do it. It's not about telling people we should. But it's simply just going all the way to the other end and go, forget about the how and the why. But why don't we just think about what if we just did and think backward? What would we be thinking about then? Mm-hmm. And how would you be resolving that in your own head if that is a given, if the end point is a given?
Absolutely. And I think that this, sort of this grasping for truth, right? For like the capital T truth, like, no, this is real, is so deeply human. One of the, I wonder if you had to read this when you were a grad student or an undergrad. We always teach Thomas Kuhn's On the Structure of Scientific Revolutions to undergraduates in the history of science. And it's a really fascinating book because it's functionally a schematic diagram of how scientific revolutions happen, right? Sort of how you move from one paradigm to the next is where we get the term paradigm shift from. But sort of buried in the back of the book, towards the end of the book, Kuhn makes this suggestion that like subsequent motions in science might be like subsequent motions or movements in art, right? And we never think of subsequent movements in art as progressing towards a greater truth, right? Necessarily, we just think of them as changing, right? And so it's a really interesting foil because we always think of science as something that's advancing us towards this clearer knowledge, right? And I think it's the thing that is most frightening to us, right, is the idea that plane of certainty might not actually exist, right? Which when you start creeping into the realm of relativity, right, it becomes harder and harder, I think, to make those arguments, right? And so I think that your provocation is a really fascinating one, right? To what extent is sort of the truth and sort of a real material description of something as living or not even going to be important?
I have more thoughts. Lois, that was beautifully said, both of you. And I think that, you had a picture of Aragorn in the middle of all of this, right? And he's a handsome dude, so I get it. He should be in every presentation. But I was thinking,
is he your friend?
We hang out. I think for me, when you think about something like the journey of the Fellowship of the Ring, right? Does it really matter what is at the end?
It's
what
the friends you make along the way.
Exactly. Is that journey. If you can convince people to come together through stories, right? To go on a journey, not on a journey to see a particular geoengineering solution come to life, right? Just go on that journey together. And just like the Goonies or the Fellowship of the Ring, figure out some shit, right? While they're on that journey. I mean, that's the best thing you can ever get. I really do believe that, because in the end, and I just learned about Kuhn's from you. Wow. I told you I'm not a scientist. I'm a mathematical physicist.
Okay, see,
right?
Nobody ever wants to be a historian. It's always physicist or artist.
It's really cool that you're like, that sounds amazing, actually. That's very profound. The paradigm shifted at the end of the book, and only you would know something like that, right? That is like, well, actually, maybe it's movements like in art. That is exactly what is going on. Because for the longest time, we thought that, okay, what did Newton do relative to all the previous smart people, that tried to understand how gravity worked? From Copernicus and Galileo and Aristotle, who was a complete dumbass when it came to gravity. But what did he? He just refined and understood a bit better what they did before. What did Einstein do? Well, he understood a bit better in a bit more general context, but didn't. It went closer and closer to truth. That is false. That is categorically false. And again, quantum physics came in to just break all of that, that illusion just gone. What is actually going on is that by engineering over time more interesting points of view to look at the same thing, you end up seeing more interesting, more general phenomena appear. It's just that the engineering the process of new points of view relies on building on top of previous points of view. Every technology, everything we do, even when we move in space, everything we have ever done and we will ever do is a point of view. The fact that we can, talk on cell phones right now and telepathically connecting with somebody across the globe is a new way to look at the universe and be part of it, to observe it, the information that is in there and always has been there. But it was called telepathy or magic 100 years ago, right? It is a new point of view, and the process of getting to more and more advanced technologies is nothing but the process of being able to occupy more and more interesting points of view. That's it. And to do that, you have to get outside of yourself. The easiest way to become smarter, right, to expand your point of view and hence be able to see the world in more interesting ways is to literally connect with somebody else who is not you. Why? Because it infects your point of view with theirs and creates this entanglement, this larger point of view.
Before you finish that sentence with the entanglement. See, what I thought, like right at this moment, I thought, all right, he's gonna say stories. He's gonna say that's how we do it, because and in a way maybe that's why stories are so amazing, because it's another form of that connection, right? You said it, that to be smarter is to actually expand your point of view or think outside of yourself. How about try thinking not from your own point of view for a while? And connecting with people for sure, but for introverts like myself, stories is where I go, to help. And I genuinely think that that's how people can be smarter, is to live through other people's lives, and stories help you to do that. Stories help you to think about things that you weren't even going to think about to start with. It's kind of put in front of you and go, hey, try. I've done the thought experiment for you.
Yeah.
How about try kind of walk through that steps and see how you feel?
There is something insane when you realize and you look at the world like in a very physical point of view. Because you said like stories, right? And I said entanglement. Guess what? I win, right? Why? Because everything in the universe, when I'm speaking right now, right? Do you think that I go into your brain and put stuff in there? No, right?
No?
There is, these are sound waves, which if you look at what it even means, these are sound waves that you can decode in your brain because you speak the same language, and they create meaning, and then they move you to do actions, and they can change your life, right? To say you're about to hear news from a doctor about somebody you really care about. It's almost like a 0-1 situation. The operation was successful, the operation was not successful. The sound wave of not, right, can change your life. Just this thing that is just, it's imperceptible. It has no weight, basically, okay? And it can change everything. That's what stories are, but they are physical manifestations of connections where your state of being and their state of being becomes connected. And it's a very strange thing how it works. There's a multiverse. It is true, okay? Beyond even the many worlds interpretation we have heard about, something way more amazing is going on. And what it means for you to be connected with another person at a particular state, right, that they're happy or they're not happy and to affect you, is that all the other universes in which that other person acted differently are gone. You are connected, right? You are filtering away all the other ones, and you only exist in relationship to the other person in all the universes where the two of you have that relationship. And then this can change and evolve over time, but these are just nothing but points of view changing and creating the illusion of a movie, of moving through stuff. It's stories because every story is about connection, right? Even when you look at the world, you don't see it as it is, you see it as you are. Like there's a messenger, the photons, right? Particles of light, connecting, entangling with the molecules of everything around, and then coming and hitting your retina, right? To create a story about the world around you. You close off that connection, either because you cannot hear or see, and it's as if the world disappears. You disappear, right? What a happy thought.
That is a lovely thought.
I have many thoughts, but maybe people are getting hungry and
Thank you so much to Spiros and Lois.
Thank you for having us.
all
Guys.
for coming.